August 28, 1945, Yokohama, Japan. The summer heat pressed against the wooden walls of the makeshift quarters near Yokohama port, where 23 women sat in silence, their hands folded in their laps. Outside, the sound of American military trucks rumbled through streets still scarred by firebombing. The air carried ash and salt from Tokyo Bay. These women, aged between 17 and 34, had been assembled by Japanese authorities 3 days prior, told only that they would serve the occupying forces. They had been given new cotton yukatas, instructed to bathe, and provided with medical examinations. None of them spoke. Each knew what was expected. Each had heard the stories their mothers whispered about the rape of Nanking, about what conquering armies do to the women of defeated nations. In the corner, a woman named Yiko smoothed the fabric of her yukata for the 100th time. She had worked in a textile factory before the fire raids reduced it to ash. Her brother had died at Okinawa. Her father had perished when the B-29s came. Her mother had volunteered her for this duty, believing it would spare their family from starvation. The Japanese government had created the Recreation and Amusement Association, the RAA, in the frantic days following surrender, a desperate attempt to protect what they called respectable women by offering up others. The official directive had been clear: provide comfort stations for the occupation forces, prevent the defilement of Japan's unmarried daughters and wives. It was presented as patriotic duty. It was survival dressed in the language of sacrifice. Yiko had been told by the RAA administrators what to expect. American soldiers, they said, were barbaric. They would be violent, rough, insatiable. They would treat Japanese women as the spoils of war. The administrators spoke in clinical terms about what would happen, how many soldiers to expect, how to endure. There had been no discussion of refusal. There had been no discussion of choice. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. Emperor Hirohito had spoken on the radio for the first time in history, his voice thin and distant, speaking in classical Japanese so formal that many couldn't fully understand his words. But the meaning was clear: endure the unendurable, bear the unbearable. The trucks outside stopped, boots on gravel, American voices, casual and loud in a way that seemed almost careless. The door opened and sunlight cut across the dim room. Yiko closed her eyes and waited for the nightmare to begin. To understand what happened in that room, in that moment, requires understanding the vast chasm between expectation and reality, a chasm carved by years of propaganda, by genuine atrocities witnessed and reported, by the complete ideological disconnect between two nations that had just concluded the most brutal war in human history. The Pacific War had been characterized by a savagery that shocked even veterans of the European theater. No quarter given, no mercy shown. Japanese soldiers fought to the death rather than surrender, believing capture meant torture and execution. American Marines developed a reputation for ruthlessness, hardened by island campaigns where surrender was not an option either side truly offered. When Okinawa fell in June 1945, stories of mass civilian suicide spread through the Japanese home islands. Mothers throwing children from cliffs. Families huddled in caves choosing grenades over capture. The narrative was consistent. Americans were demons, and death was preferable to falling into their hands. The Japanese government knew what its own soldiers had done in China, in Korea, in the Philippines, in every territory they had occupied. The comfort women system itself, the forced sexual slavery of over 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories, was known to Japanese authorities, even if it was not publicly acknowledged. The systematic rape and brutalization had been policy, organized and administered by the Imperial Japanese Army. The comfort stations established across the Pacific were brutal holding facilities where women were raped dozens of times daily, beaten, tortured, and often worked to death. The Japanese military had created an industrial system of sexual slavery. When Japan surrendered, the authorities assumed, with the logic born of their own actions, that the Americans would do the same. They assumed that every horror they had inflicted would be returned tenfold. The American military had demonstrated total air superiority, reducing Japanese cities to ash with incendiary bombs. They had deployed atomic weapons, erasing Hiroshima and Nagasaki in blinding flashes of light. What mercy could possibly follow such overwhelming force? What restraint could be expected from an enemy you had attacked without warning, an enemy whose prisoners you had starved and tortured, whose wounded you had executed, whose dead you had desecrated? The Recreation and Amusement Association was established on August 18, 1945, 3 days after surrender, 2 weeks before American forces would arrive in strength. The organization requisitioned buildings, recruited women through a combination of promises and pressure, and opened the first comfort station on August 27 in Aomori. The goal was explicit: channel the expected sexual violence of the occupation forces toward a designated group of women, thereby protecting the general female population. The Japanese government allocated substantial funds, 30 million yen, an enormous sum, to establish the RAA. They commandeered buildings, provided supplies, and worked with astonishing speed to create an infrastructure of organized prostitution. Advertisements appeared in newspapers, veiled in euphemistic language, calling for women to participate in the great task of comforting the occupation forces. Some women volunteered, seeing no other option for survival in a devastated economy. Many more were coerced, pressured by families desperate for food, or simply assigned by local authorities. The women recruited represented the most vulnerable: war widows with no means of support, factory workers whose workplaces had been destroyed, women from poor rural families. Some were as young as 14, their ages falsified on documents. They were told they would serve their country one final time. They were told they would prevent a greater catastrophe. They were told to endure. When the first American soldiers entered the comfort stations in late August and early September 1945, the women braced for violence. They had been trained to expect brutality. They had been instructed on how to survive encounters with men they had been told were savages. Instead, they encountered something their entire worldview had not prepared them to understand. The first shock was courtesy. American soldiers, by and large, treated the women politely. They knocked before entering rooms. They asked permission. They introduced themselves by name. This behavior was so unexpected that many women initially interpreted it as a form of psychological torture, a cruel prelude to violence. Some soldiers brought gifts: chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum, canned goods from their rations. They made small talk, attempted basic Japanese phrases, showed photographs of girlfriends and wives back home. They seemed, impossibly, to regard the women as human beings rather than enemy chattels. Yiko's first American client was a staff sergeant from Ohio named Robert Hartley. He was 24 years old, had landed at Okinawa in April, and had seen friends die in the brutal final campaign of the war. He entered the room where Yiko waited, removed his cap, and stood awkwardly near the door. He asked, in broken Japanese learned from a phrase book, if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. Yiko stared at him in confusion. This was not the monster she had been warned about. This was a nervous young man, who seemed almost as uncomfortable as she was. What happened next was recorded in Yiko's diary, which she kept secret for decades and only published in her 80s, long after the war had become history. Hartley sat on the floor across from her. He did not touch her. He talked, in English she did not understand, showing her pictures of a farm in Ohio, of his mother and father, of a dog named Buck. He gave her a chocolate bar, which she was too frightened to eat until he pantomimed that it was safe, that it was a gift. After 30 minutes he stood, bowed awkwardly in the Japanese manner he had clearly just learned, and left. He paid the required fee to the RAA administrators. He did not touch her. This scene repeated across the comfort stations with variations. Not every soldier was respectful. Not every encounter was gentle. There were Americans who drank too much, who were rough, who treated the women with the casual cruelty that any system of prostitution enables. But the systematic brutality that had been expected, that had been prepared for, did not materialize. Instead, there was an unexpected pattern. Many American soldiers seemed troubled by the very existence of the comfort stations. Some refused to participate at all. Others paid the fee but spent their time simply talking to the women, practicing Japanese, showing photographs, sharing rations. The confusion this caused among the women was profound. The Japanese authorities had prepared the women for rape. They had prepared them for violence. They had prepared them for dehumanization. They had not prepared them for kindness. They had not prepared them for soldiers who seemed to see them as individual people rather than faceless objects. This cognitive dissonance created a crisis of understanding. If the Americans were not the demons Japanese propaganda had described, what else had been a lie? The symbolic object that came to represent this confusion was the chocolate bar. American soldiers carried them as part of their rations, Hershey's tropical bars, designed to withstand heat, dense and sweet, and unlike anything most Japanese civilians had tasted in years. Japan had been under severe rationing since 1940. Sugar had become almost non-existent for ordinary people. Children born during the war years had never tasted candy. When American soldiers casually handed out chocolate bars to comfort women, to children on the street, to anyone they encountered, it represented something more than simple generosity. It represented abundance. It represented a nation that could afford to give away luxury items to its soldiers as routine supplies. It represented a fundamental difference in national capability that no amount of propaganda had successfully communicated. Japanese wartime propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent, individualistic, and weak, a mongrel nation lacking the spiritual purity and martial discipline of Japan. The Yamato spirit, Japanese leaders had insisted, would overcome American material advantage. Yet here were these American soldiers, each one seemingly able to distribute more calories in casual gifts than many Japanese families saw in a week. The chocolate bars, the cigarettes, the canned goods, the casual abundance. It told a story about industrial capacity, about logistics, about a nation that had fought a two-front war across two oceans and had emerged not exhausted but overwhelmingly powerful. The transformation in understanding happened gradually, woman by woman, encounter by encounter. Yiko began to save the items American soldiers gave her: chocolate wrappers, cigarette packages, a small American flag from a soldier's uniform. These objects became a hidden shrine to a world that contradicted everything she had been taught. She wrote in her diary that she felt as though she had been living in a cave her entire life, seeing only shadows on the wall, and suddenly someone had dragged her into sunlight so bright it hurt. Other women reported similar experiences. A woman named Fumiko, who worked at a comfort station in Tokyo, described a soldier who brought her a map and showed her where America was, how large it was, how many cities it contained. She had known, intellectually, that America was large, but seeing the map, seeing the scale, she realized she had never truly understood the enormity of the nation Japan had chosen to fight. The soldier told her, through gestures and broken Japanese, about factories that stretched for miles, about farms that fed millions, about universities and libraries and museums. He was not boasting. He was simply trying to explain his home. But to Fumiko, who had lived her entire life in a nation that had militarized every aspect of existence, that had turned schools into barracks and factories into weapons plants, the description sounded like a fairy tale. The psychological impact was profound. These women had been prepared to sacrifice themselves to protect Japan from barbarians. Instead, they found themselves face to face with young men who seemed, in most cases, fundamentally decent. Men who showed them photographs of families. Men who apologized for the war. Men who expressed discomfort with the entire arrangement of the comfort stations. Some soldiers, learning the truth about how the women had been recruited, refused to participate and reported the stations to their commanding officers. This eventually led to the American Military Command pressuring Japanese authorities to shut down the RAA stations in early 1946, declaring them inconsistent with American values and policy. That decision, the American Military Command shutting down the comfort stations, was itself shocking to the women involved. It suggested that the Americans had standards, policies, rules that applied even to conquered enemies. It suggested a moral framework that did not simply bend to military expediency. The Imperial Japanese Army had operated comfort stations throughout its occupied territories with no oversight, no regulation, no concern for the women trapped in them. The idea that a conquering army would shut down facilities specifically created for their use, would do so because of ethical concerns, was alien to everything the women had experienced and understood about military power. The records from this period are fragmentary. The RAA tried to destroy many documents as the stations were closed. The Japanese government was not eager to preserve evidence of how it had organized sexual services for the occupation forces. Many of the women involved never spoke publicly about their experiences, carrying the shame and trauma in silence until death. But the testimonies that do exist, collected by historians decades later, paint a consistent picture. Profound confusion giving way to a painful realization that they had been lied to about the nature of the enemy and the nature of the war. The broader context makes the women's shock comprehensible. Japanese wartime indoctrination had been total and pervasive. From the moment Japan began its expansion into China in 1937, the government had controlled information with absolute authority. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, school curriculum, all reinforced the same narratives. Americans were materialistic cowards who valued comfort over honor. Americans were racially inferior, a mixed-blood nation lacking unity. Americans would never endure the casualties necessary to defeat Japan. The Americans who did fight would commit atrocities upon capture, justifying the Japanese military's policy of fighting to the death. These narratives served multiple purposes. They maintained morale as the war situation deteriorated. They justified extreme measures, kamikaze attacks, civilian militia preparations, the planned defense of the home islands that would have resulted in millions of Japanese deaths. They made sense of why Japan was losing. If Americans were inferior in spirit, then Japan's defeats must be temporary, caused by material disadvantage that would be overcome by superior will. The alternative, that Japan had fundamentally miscalculated, that American industrial and military power was overwhelming, that the war had been unwinnable from the start, was too devastating to acknowledge. When the emperor announced surrender, many Japanese citizens did not believe it was real. Some military units refused to accept the order. Hardliners attempted a coup to prevent the surrender announcement from being broadcast. The idea that Japan could be defeated was, for many, literally unthinkable. The emperor's divinity had been state doctrine. The military's honor had been absolute. The righteousness of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had been unquestionable. Surrender meant all of it was a lie. The women of the comfort stations experienced this shattering of worldview in the most intimate way possible. They had been told Americans were monsters. Instead, Americans brought them food. They had been told to expect torture. Instead, they received courtesy. They had been told Americans would treat them as subhuman. Instead, American soldiers often seemed uncomfortable with the entire arrangement, as though it violated their own sense of dignity and honor. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some women broke under this realization. Medical records from the period, incomplete as they are, document cases of women who became catatonic, who refused to eat, who required psychiatric intervention. The psychological term had not yet been coined, but what they experienced was a form of cognitive trauma, the violent shattering of a comprehensive belief system. Everything they had known about the world, about the enemy, about their own sacrifice, was revealed to be based on lies. If the Americans were not demons, then the Japanese government had sacrificed them unnecessarily. If Americans treated them with basic humanity, then what did that say about the Japanese military's treatment of comfort women in occupied territories? The questions spiraled inward, each answer revealing new layers of betrayal. The epilogue to the comfort stations was complicated and painful. When American authorities shut them down in early 1946, the women were left without the promised government support. Many had been ostracized by their families for participating, even though participation had been coerced. The stigma of prostitution attached to them, despite the fact that they had been following government directives. Some turned to street prostitution to survive. Some committed suicide. Some disappeared into Japan's rebuilding cities and tried to construct new lives from the ruins of the old. Yiko eventually married a Japanese businessman in 1951. She never told her husband about her time in the RAA. She kept her diary hidden in a locked box for 50 years. Only after her husband died, only after Japan had transformed itself into an economic powerhouse, only after enough time had passed that the wounds of the war had scarred over, did she finally publish her account. She did so, she wrote, because she wanted people to understand what war does to women. Not just the physical violence, though that is real and terrible, but the psychological violence of being used as a pawn, of being told your sacrifice serves a noble purpose, only to discover that the purpose itself was a lie built on lies built on lies. Other women who survived the comfort stations echoed similar themes in their testimonies. They spoke of feeling betrayed not by the Americans, but by their own government. They spoke of the peculiar cruelty of being prepared for one kind of horror and experiencing, instead, a different kind of trauma. The trauma of realizing they had been manipulated, used, and discarded by the very nation they had been told they were serving. The Americans, in many accounts, appear almost as supporting characters. The real antagonist was the system that had put the women there in the first place. The chocolate bars, the cigarettes, the canned goods, these objects of casual American abundance, became symbols of a larger truth. Japan had mobilized every resource for total war. Citizens had donated metal to be melted down for weapons. Food had been rationed to near starvation levels. Children had been drilled in fighting with bamboo spears to resist the expected American invasion. Every ounce of national effort had been directed toward the war machine. And yet Japan had lost, overwhelmingly, to a nation whose soldiers could afford to give away luxury foods as casual gifts. The records show that in September 1945 alone, American forces distributed over 50,000 tons of food aid to prevent starvation in Japan. This was done not as a magnanimous gesture, but as practical necessity. The American occupation authorities needed a stable population to govern, and a starving population would be unstable. But to Japanese civilians who received American rice, American canned goods, American medical supplies, the aid represented something that didn't fit the narrative they had been fed for 8 years. Enemies did not feed those they conquered. Demons did not provide medicine to prevent epidemics. Barbarians did not establish democratic institutions and write constitutions guaranteeing rights. The women of the comfort stations were among the first Japanese civilians to experience this contradiction directly. Their shock was the shock of cognitive dissonance taken to its extreme. They had prepared themselves to endure the unendurable. They had steeled themselves for brutality. They had accepted that they would be sacrificed to protect others. And then the sacrifice was not required, or rather, it was required but not in the way they had been told. The trauma was not the physical violence they had expected. The trauma was the realization that their own government had lied to them, had used them, had created an entire system of organized prostitution based on false assumptions about what the occupation would entail. The transformation of understanding extended beyond the individual women to Japanese society more broadly, though it took years to manifest fully. The occupation period, 1945 to 1952, forced Japan to confront the reality of American power and American values. The American occupation was not without problems, errors, and injustices, but it was fundamentally different from what Japanese propaganda had predicted. Americans did not massacre the population. They did not enslave the Japanese people. They did not destroy Japanese culture. Instead, they implemented democratic reforms, established freedom of speech and press, granted women's suffrage, broke up the Zaibatsu monopolies, and wrote a constitution that renounced war. These reforms were imposed by a foreign power, but they were reforms nonetheless. For the women who had worked in the comfort stations, this transformation was both validation and additional trauma. They had discovered at the most intimate level that the enemy was not what they had been told. They had learned this truth through their own bodies, their own interactions, their own gradual realization that propaganda and reality were vastly different. But society was not ready to hear their stories. The shame of defeat was too fresh. The need to rebuild was too urgent. The comfort stations were an embarrassing footnote, quickly buried under layers of collective amnesia. It would take decades before historians began seriously documenting the RAA and the experiences of the women who worked there. By that time, most had died. Those who survived were elderly, traumatized, and often reluctant to speak. The testimony that exists is fragmentary, incomplete, heavily mediated by time and trauma. But the core narrative remains consistent. The women expected hell and found something else. Not paradise. The comfort stations were still sites of exploitation, of economic coercion, of a system that treated women's bodies as resources to be managed. But the specific hell they had been prepared for did not materialize. Instead, they encountered American soldiers who were, more often than not, human beings capable of basic decency. This created a painful paradox. The women had been victimized by their own government's lies and coercion, but the Americans, who they had expected to victimize them, often treated them better than their own authorities had. This did not make the Americans heroes in the women's stories. It made the Japanese government's betrayal even more profound. The women had been sacrificed unnecessarily, based on propaganda rather than reality, used as human shields against a threat that did not exist in the form they had been told. The symbolic chocolate bar appears throughout testimonies from this period. It represents not just food, though in starving Japan, food was desperately important. It represents a casual abundance that spoke to fundamental differences in national power. The United States had fought a war across 2 oceans, deployed millions of soldiers, built thousands of ships and planes, developed nuclear weapons, and maintained a civilian economy that, while rationed, never approached the desperate scarcity Japan experienced. American soldiers ate better than most Japanese civilians. American soldiers had medical care, decent equipment, regular pay. Japanese soldiers in the final years of the war were often starving, dressed in deteriorating uniforms, equipped with obsolete weapons, and expected to die rather than surrender because surrender meant they had failed the emperor. When American soldiers handed out chocolate bars, they were demonstrating, perhaps without fully realizing it, the sheer depth of the industrial and economic power gap between the two nations. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor believing that American decadence and lack of martial spirit would prevent a sustained war effort. The Japanese military had calculated that a quick series of victories would secure a defensive perimeter that America would lack the will to penetrate. This calculation was based on fundamental misunderstandings of American culture, American industrial capacity, and American determination when attacked. The women of the comfort stations learned this truth through the smallest details: the quality of American soap, the sturdiness of American boots, the ubiquity of American cigarettes, the fact that ordinary soldiers had wristwatches, fountain pens, cameras. These were not luxuries the American military had specially provided. These were standard items that ordinary soldiers owned. The accumulation of small observations built into an undeniable conclusion. Japan had been comprehensively outmatched from the beginning. In reflecting on this history, several truths emerge about war, propaganda, and human nature. The first is that propaganda works until reality intrudes. The Japanese government had constructed an elaborate narrative about American barbarism to justify its own policies and maintain morale. This narrative was believed because people had no access to contradictory information. The state controlled all media. Foreign news was filtered or fabricated. Dissent was criminal. In such an environment, the official truth became the only truth most people knew. When that truth collapsed upon direct experience, the psychological impact was shattering. The second truth is that systems of exploitation operate on dehumanization. The comfort women system, both the Imperial Japanese Army's version in occupied territories and the RAA's version in occupied Japan, required treating women as objects rather than people. The Japanese military's comfort stations subjected women to unspeakable brutality because the women were not considered fully human. They were Korean, Chinese, Filipino, or from other inferior populations. Their suffering did not register as morally significant. The RAA operators assumed American soldiers would treat Japanese comfort women the same way because that was how soldiers treated conquered women. The fact that many American soldiers did not, that many were uncomfortable with the entire system, revealed that dehumanization is not a universal constant. It is a choice, one that can be resisted even in war. The third truth is that kindness, even in exploitative systems, has power. The American soldiers who treated the comfort women with basic decency were not heroes. They were still participating in a system of organized prostitution. Many still paid for sex with women who had limited alternatives. The system itself was unjust. But within that unjust system, individual acts of kindness, sharing food, showing photographs, treating the women as people rather than objects, had disproportionate impact. These acts contradicted years of propaganda. They opened cracks in the ideological certainty that had sustained the war effort. They demonstrated that enemies could be human, that the other was not necessarily monstrous. This is not a comfortable truth. It does not fit neatly into narratives of good versus evil. It suggests that even in deeply flawed systems, even in contexts of exploitation, humans retain the capacity for decency. This does not excuse the system. This does not erase the harm, but it complicates the story in ways that simplistic narratives cannot accommodate. The final truth is about freedom and abundance. The chocolate bars were symbols of an economic and political system that, whatever its flaws, produced enough wealth that ordinary soldiers could give away luxury foods. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of democratic capitalism, of industrial development unconstrained by military dictatorship, of a society that allowed innovation and rewarded productivity. Japan had chosen a different path: militaristic expansion, authoritarian control, subordination of individual rights to state needs. That path had led to total war, total defeat, and near total destruction. The women of the comfort stations witnessed this difference at the most intimate level. They saw the fruits of American abundance in every interaction. The well-fed soldiers, the good equipment, the casual generosity, and they saw the fruits of Japanese militarism in their own circumstances, coerced into service, used by their own government, left vulnerable because total war had consumed every resource and every person. The contrast was impossible to ignore. After the occupation ended, Japan rebuilt. It rebuilt as a democracy, adopting many of the reforms the Americans had imposed. It rebuilt its economy using American aid and American markets. It rebuilt its society, granting women rights they had never possessed before. The women who had worked in the comfort stations were mostly forgotten in this rebuilding. Their stories were buried, their trauma unacknowledged. But the lessons they had learned, about propaganda and reality, about power and vulnerability, about systems that use people and discard them, those lessons remained relevant. Yiko, in her diary published decades later, wrote that she had learned two things from her experience. First, that governments lie to their people, especially during war, and that the lies are believed because people desperately want to believe them. Second, that individuals, even in terrible circumstances, can choose to be decent or cruel, and that choice matters. She wrote that the American soldiers who treated her kindly did not erase the trauma of being in the comfort station. But they did prove that the enemy she had been taught to hate was a lie. And that revelation, painful as it was, freed her from a lifetime of believing in lies. The epilogue to the Recreation and Amusement Association's comfort stations is written in the lives of the women who survived them and the society that tried to forget them. For decades, the topic was taboo. Japan did not want to discuss how it had organized prostitution for the occupation forces. The women did not want to be marked by shame. Historians did not want to complicate the narrative of American beneficence during the occupation. But slowly, as years became decades, as Japan transformed into an economic superpower, as the war generation died and new generations sought to understand their history, the stories began to emerge. They emerged in fragments: a diary published when the author was 87, an interview conducted 50 years after the fact, a historian's archival research uncovering RAA documents that had been hidden. Each fragment added to the larger picture. Women prepared for nightmare, experiencing instead a different kind of trauma, learning truths that shattered their understanding of the world. The chocolate bar, that persistent symbol, appears in museum exhibits now, in documentaries about the occupation, in academic papers about the cultural clash between Japanese militarism and American democratic capitalism. It represents the power of material abundance to undermine ideology. It represents the small kindnesses that can survive even in systems designed for exploitation. It represents the gap between propaganda and reality, a gap so vast that it could not be bridged by government directives or ideological purity. The women who worked in the comfort stations deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to occupation history, but as witnesses to a profound moment of transformation. They experienced, directly and intimately, the collapse of one world and the emergence of another. They were used by systems that saw them as expendable. They were traumatized by experiences that violated them regardless of whether violence was physical or psychological. But they also saw something unexpected: enemies who were human, a world beyond propaganda, and the possibility that the truths they had been taught were lies. This recognition came at terrible cost, but it came. And in coming, it suggested that even in war, even in occupation, even in the darkest circumstances, reality eventually intrudes on propaganda. The truth eventually emerges, and people, given the chance, often choose decency over cruelty, humanity over dehumanization, kindness over violence. That is the legacy of the comfort stations in occupied Japan. Not a simple story of victimization, not a redemptive narrative of American virtue, but a complex testimony to the power of reality to shatter ideology, the capacity of individuals to retain humanity in dehumanizing systems, and the painful process of discovering that everything you were taught to believe was a carefully constructed lie. The women learned these truths in the most intimate way possible. And their testimonies, recovered decades later, stand as witness to the vast gulf between what war propaganda promises and what human beings, faced with each other across the divide of supposed enmity, actually choose to do.